Today we have a special guest and a good friend of mine is Dirk Forrister. He's President and CEO of IETA. IETA is the International Emission Trading Association. And he's today with us to discuss about impressions from COP29 and also interesting developments that could be relevant also from a European perspective. So first of all, Dirk, welcome and thanks for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Nicola. It's a pleasure to be here.
And likewise, I'm pleased to have you here. So a few days have passed from the COP29. Now it's over. We've seen a lot of coverage, lots of emotions. What's your take?
Well, I think for the business community, the biggest issue at the last several COPs has been around how the carbon market elements are going to emerge, just because they affect the ambitions that countries or companies aspire to in the future. They affect the possible financial flows from corporates into emission mitigation around the world. And one of the hot topics at this COP was climate finance. So how much is going to be public finance from governments and how much could be expected from private sector finance? The world of private finance kind of lands in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And we had some breakthroughs at this COP, notably on the final day and the final hours. We got agreement on some of the operational provisions of the part of Article 6 that deals with bilateral cooperation. It's in, we call it 6.2, that subparagraph of that article. And that's the article that a number of countries are already utilizing, because there were some basic rules, but there needed to be some fine-tuning around what registry services would be available at a UN level. For transparency purposes, what would be available at a UN level, to have an international registry where you could kind of see what's being used for compliance and what is being banked for future use, and kind of have the visibility into what's happening in the underlying market. And then also some of the rules around how you get approvals or authorizations from a host government that wants to host a carbon reduction project. They're going to make the credits available for export. And this portion of Article 6 described what would be needed in an authorization in terms of who's issuing and how it might be used and how they're going to track it. So, and notably, whether they could revoke an authorization, and if so, under what circumstances. So we got a compromise on all of those things, which I think is really useful to the process.
No, I think it's great, and it's a very good summary, but I think that you and I are all folks, and we know all about it, but maybe our colleagues that are watching us might not be fully familiar with all the nitty-gritty of the UN process. So maybe at first, background information, what is this Article 6? What is it? Was in there? Why is it so important from a business point of view? And then maybe we can discuss about what happened in Baku.
Yeah. So Article 6 is a fundamental part of the Paris Agreement. So if you support the Paris Agreement, you're supporting Article 6 because it's a fundamental piece of it. And if you read it, you wouldn't think it has anything to do with carbon markets, because it talks about voluntary cooperation between countries. But the way that that's implemented with businesses is around trading of emission credits across international borders. So Article 6 is mainly about assuring that the accounting of trades between countries is trued up at the end, and is that there isn't any double counting in it, so that the sales and the buys and the uses are clear and understood and transparent and fundamentally have integrity. So so that's what Article 6 is about. But it has these two pieces that I was getting at. One is Article 6.2, which is about bilateral cooperation. So Japan, for example, has MOUs with around 30 other countries where it hopes to allow for credits to be created jointly between those governments, and Japanese companies might buy those credits for use in a compliance system in Japan or against their voluntary commitments in Japan. There are a number of other governments that are doing similar things, South Korea, Singapore, and a number of countries are thinking about how they might want to use that portion of the agreement to sell to those jurisdictions. In the future, we hope it's broad participation because and broad use of markets, because that will help bring the costs down for businesses, but also it will hopefully reduce some of the trade frictions by creating a flow of commerce in a positive way between participating countries. So Article 6 also has another provision dealing with actual crediting of projects at a UN level. You're allowed to use that if you want, or you can use voluntary crediting programs like are in common use in the United States, for example. That would be the VERA or the Gold Standard or American Carbon Registry. Some of those are crediting programs. So those crediting programs generally fall under 6.2, whereas the UN crediting mechanism under 6.4 is another option, but could be available maybe more widely because any country that's part of the Paris Agreement could use it. So I think those are the fundamentals of what 6.2 is about. 6.4, there's also another provision you'll remember, Nicola, about non-market approaches that might also be a form of cooperation, and that's included in a different part of Article 6. But that also received a bit of a burst of energy from the approvals done this time.
Yeah, and I have to say, while I was still packing to get to Baku, already your colleagues were already there, and the first thing, okay, we have a text on 6.4, like, whoa, so we have maybe started and there's already something happened, and there was this kind of momentum, and then on 6.2, probably also the tiredness of the negotiations, the emotions that were growing, you were saying there's a compromise. So maybe can you tell us, help us understanding what was the breakthrough on 6.4, and then also on this 6.2 exactly, where are we, what does it mean compromise, and also what's next, actually.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought this up because it's true, like on carbon markets, we normally don't get anything until the end. But on the early stage, I think the second day of the COP, we got a report from the governing board of the 6.4 mechanism that had a set of standards that were approved that sort of gave a jump start to the process. So they brought their package in, and it got a sort of, the presidency took charge of this, the Azerbaijan presidency, and they got it gavelled through at the very beginning of the COP. And it kind of gave a burst of energy, not just for carbon markets, but for the whole COP, because they actually got something done at the beginning. And that sort of proved that they could get agreement on something. Well, that wasn't the only thing that we wanted in Article 6, because they've been working on further guidance, which is UN terminology for the COP, telling this the parties what additional rules are going to apply. So this further guidance related largely to 6.2, but also to a few other elements of Article 6.4. That one took a grueling 2 weeks to get to. It was the last thing agreed, I think. So you talk about unpacking your bags when you got there. When you're getting ready to go home from the COP, you would be watching on the screen potentially and seeing that, at least what we were seeing was negotiators are starting to file back in the room. Our members are talking to those negotiators about, well, what happened? What are we going to get on Article 6? And the views were mixed. They sort of thought it may have fallen apart. It might not happen. But it did come together at the end. And I think that was largely driven by work between the European Union and the United States on resolving differences on how the international registry that's provided under 6.2, how that would work. So for those that aren't familiar with carbon markets, the credits sit in registries. It's almost like the recorder of deeds if you own a home, you know, where it's the registration of the deed or a car licenses or whatever. This is the ownership of credits at a UN level. And there were different views about what that registry system could look like, and it's highly technical, but they basically came up with sort of a two-pronged system where there's a basic registry that tracks the net flows between countries in their reports. It needs to be consistent with reports, but it's the place where you can avoid double counting in bilateral trades. So the other piece they agreed to, though, was if an individual country wants to be given registry services for their own ETS, their own emissions trading program at home, but they wanted to be in a UN format, they could use a secondary registry, a service layer of this registry system for that purpose. I think that was a healthy compromise because it sort of gives the clarity and transparency that the EU is looking for, and I think the US cared a lot about on the fundamental level, but it also has the service offering which could be important for developing countries. So we were happy with that they finally came to a common agreement on it.
Okay, thanks. And you mentioned the key word EU happy, which right. I think we're going to get back to that in a moment because it can have lots of interesting spins also from a European perspective. But first, so Article 6, job done? Or
well, I think it's the UN rulebook is done. At least for the time being. They will continue to review, but I think they won't review it in detail again until something like 2028. So it does mean job done at this level, but of course the real magic is going to be in how countries choose to use Article 6. So for example, I mentioned Japan that's got a fairly forward-leaning program about how they intend to use it, but many other countries haven't decided yet. I think we're going into an era now where developing countries in particular will be setting up their own national frameworks for how they intend to use Article 6 to draw investment to particular types of projects that they need funding for. And I think you'll also see some developed countries give more clarity to how they intend to use Article 6 for purchases. So we know, there's some national purchases from Switzerland and Sweden and Norway, also by Singapore. But in Japan, South Korea, there's more corporate purchasing for use in a compliance system. So I think we'll see more OECD countries outlining what they intend to do going forward now that we have the rule book. Mm-hmm. So hopefully it's not quite, at least I don't feel like it's done until the implementation side at a national level really starts to generate both supply and demand.
Okay. And clear. I think we have learned also in European sphere, like implementation is always the key, and that's where right. You see all the pain and but also the beauty of seeing a project finally moving on. And that really brings us to we're in Brussels. Mm-hmm. We discussed about the EU. The EU has been extremely active in these negotiations. We know that we have experience of with the clean development mechanisms of seeing how good ideas can go, let's say, different than what was expected. And there's been a lot of attention in making sure that this time, at least we make all the efforts to make it right. And now we have an agreement. So it means that assuming that there's also the EU seems to be quite okay with the outcome. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean from a European perspective, or what could possibly mean from a European perspective, is Article 6? Which of the two souls, like 6.2 or 6.4, are the most appealing from a European perspective? And how can we move forward on this basis?
Mm-hmm. I think Europe put a lot of effort into the 6.4 mechanism. It's represented on the governing board of that mechanism, and so I think it really has a lot of interest in assuring that both the transparency is there, but that also highly confident standards that have high integrity, that can rebuild trust in those approaches. And what I hear European officials talking most about is their interest over time in seeing more of the removal technologies and removal approaches to emerge under 6.4, and for the market to kind of begin to shift to those types of strategies. What Europe hasn't done yet is to talk a lot about how it might get integrated in the broader program of achieving Europe's goals. We know there's interest in the CORSIA program, which is a crediting program for aviation, for international airlines, and those will likely be able to use 6.4 credits, but it's free under CORSIA to potentially use private crediting standards that are approved for that purpose. So that piece of demand, I think we could see start to emerge a little more dramatically in the coming years as the targets start to bite a little more for CORSIA. I think longer term, there's questions about, at least my membership is interested in how crediting programs might work as a cost mitigation measure for achieving tougher targets in the future. So I know a debate is starting in Brussels on a 2040 target. I know my members are worried about potential price spikes before then, where there may be a need for some kind of an international safety valve, which crediting programs could provide. So that's one where I think we have more work to do. Hopefully the trust is restored in the framework that's been agreed in Baku. But again, we don't know how the EU plans to use it other than CORSIA. And I think that piece is pretty clear. Europe also points to voluntary carbon markets as another potential near-term source of demand, because some companies have commitments that go beyond what is required in law in Europe. So the ones that are covered by the EU ETS, they sort of know what world they're operating in, but we have another ETS coming in, and we have some emissions that are outside either of those systems where there could be voluntary demand that emerges. And for those purposes, there's legislation pending on green claims, the Green Claims Directive, and what will it say about use of carbon credits against climate-related claims. That's one that I hope we can get reasonable rules that actually provide sort of assurance and give clarity to businesses about what are appropriate claims to make, because there may be ways that they want to connect with customers through voluntary markets that go beyond the minimums required in law. So watch this space. I'm sure you will be, knowing you, Nicola, that it's a topic that will matter potentially to a lot of your members and my members in the near term, but I think longer term, we still need to have a conversation about what role international credits or international linkages might play in the longer term fabric. All of the research that we've done at IETA says that the most cost-effective, least inflationary, most kind of business friendly in terms of incentives would be if we get a broader system of market linkages. That's going to take a while to develop, but I think it's sort of the holy grail that we're working toward.
I agree. I think we are, if we try to look at all dynamics, there is clearly the need for Europe to continue on the path towards climate neutrality. There's also a time dimension element that needs to be taken into consideration, because not everything can be done overnight. There is infrastructures to be developed. There is amount of cost competitive energy that needs to be part of the equation, and that is not built overnight. At the same time, there is an industrial dimension needs to be seen, because you, at least from European perspective, you want to make sure that this path towards carbon neutrality means investments in Europe. And of course, we've seen in the past that this international cooperation has been leading a lot into investments in industry outside of Europe, which is something that maybe today is not really the top one priority. At the same time, also the whole financing part, all this money that's been promised, where are we gonna find this money? So it seems that this Article 6 is a bit in the crossroad of all these areas. Is that also your impression?
Well, I think I'm glad you raised this point as well, because as I mentioned earlier, this was a finance COP. Next year will be an ambition COP, but it was important that the finance COP happen. They didn't call it this. This is me calling it the finance COP, but this is the COP where governments were under pressure, particularly from the OECD, to make clear how much money they were going to put forward in terms of public financing toward the climate issue. Many of the developing countries wanted more than $1 trillion per year by 2030 to be committed. Where they ended up was 300, but with ongoing efforts to mobilize up to 1.3 trillion. Okay, but the 300's the part that was more firm. And I think the challenge is that for tracking financial flows, it's hard to imagine how you would get to $1 trillion level without private sector investment, which takes you right to Article 6, because the best way, I think, of private sector participating in programs that invest in developing countries is not going to be through charity. It's going to be through a market incentive, which Article 6 provides the railway for happening. So let's see, again, as we move ahead, and Europe is looking to expand its influence through collaboration. Right now it's offering a tremendous amount of technical assistance and encouragement. Let's not forget the carbon border adjustment mechanism that's also providing a different kind of a driver for some of the key G20 countries, really, that export to Europe, for them to be setting up their own carbon pricing programs so that they can pass muster with the CBAM. I think that has been an important driver. It's like you wander around the pavilion zone at the COP, or a number of countries talking about their new carbon pricing program coming into effect. China's expanding to cover the CBAM sectors, basically. It already has an emissions trading market for the power sector, but it's adding other sectors kind of in response to CBAM. Brazil, while we were at COP, passed legislation through both its Senate and its House, lower house, for a national emissions trading program, allegedly inspired by CBAM. India's working on a program. Indonesia's working on a program. So I do think
Australia also.
Australia, right, absolutely. And I think you're going to see an emergence of more pricing program, which is a good thing. Hopefully they allow some trading flexibilities as part of the design. That's our hope. But I think we'll see more of those coming forward, kind of driven by CBAM. So all of this, though, does kind of flow through Article 6 in some way, shape, or form. And I think tracking the future financial flows is going to be one area of challenges, is how do you pick apart what's coming through public and private sources. But to get to the big numbers, the private sector role is going to be critical.
Yeah, I think also from our side we've done a bit of number crunching, and it looks like without access to international trading, the path's going to be quite tough towards 2040 and beyond.
You know, one of the things, I'm sure you've been tortured with one of our presentations on economic modeling of Article 6, but we did a set of modeling runs using a model developed by one of the U.S. national labs in the U.S. of what it takes to get to 1.5 degrees of climate protection, no more warming than 1.5 degrees, which is the high-end goal in the Paris Agreement. And what we found was, without international cooperation, based on what we know right now, the model wouldn't solve. So if countries don't cooperate together, it's very difficult to get to 1.5 degrees. A modeler would never say never. They would just say current technologies that they can model can't get you there. However, if you use Article 6 and you allow for full-scale cooperation, you can get there. So I think that sort of underscores the imperative. Frankly, right now, we're not on a 1.5 degree path. We're not on a 2 degree path. So even to get to 2 degrees, you need that level of cooperation.
Okay, so it's just a matter of getting things done,
Yeah.
basically. So, but let's just maybe one of the last questions from my side is, so let's assume that now someone from the Commission has been listening at your intervention, and they say, okay, Dirk, you're right. Tomorrow we have a press release saying the EU opens up to international crediting. What would it take? How long would it take? And what would it take to go from today reality, in which we had not, at least from an ETS compliance point of view, we don't have access to international crediting, to someday in the near future where that would be possible according to whatever rules, and we can discuss, maybe not today, another time. Mm-hmm. But how long would it take to go from today to tomorrow or the day after tomorrow?
Right. It's interesting. After the agreement came through, it's not like there were a whole bunch of announcements of new deals that have been awaiting on this, because as you're pointing out in the question, there's lead time for implementing projects on the ground. So in the host countries, it's going to be important to understand what's going to be included in their next NDC due next year, and then what's going to be available for additional investment to drive further reductions in what they're committing to. And the way many of these national targets are being communicated to the UN, there's a part that's unconditional, which the country says, we're going to do this on our own. And then there's a part, typically, where they say, this is how much additional we could offer if we had access to international finance and markets. So I think it takes a little bit of time to see those target areas, to get the contracts in place, the technology in place, and actually implement projects. So what they're saying right now is, now that the 6.4 mechanism is up and running, by the way, they're now calling it the Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism, PACM, horrible acronym, but we're going to call it PACM.
Not Pac-Man.
No, PACM.
Okay.
But the PACM mechanism will potentially have some credits issued in 2025. That's their goal, is to get it up and running from projects that have been in the pipeline that are now ready to come forward. I think that may be ambitious, because I've seen how long it takes for approvals and for the board to meet and for them to do their due diligence and proper approval processes. But I do think right now the independent standards, so Vera, American Carbon Registry, Gold Standard, they've already been anticipating this, so they're also ready to sort of provide a route to crediting. So I think, first of all, I should say, this is an area where the EU is pretty firm that they're looking only domestically. They're developing their own crediting mechanism for removals domestically, so there's an intense focus on meeting the maximum amount of the targets domestically. But the price has been going up, and right now it's in a kind of a stable area in the in the kind of 50-60 range, 50 to 60 euro range, but
even a bit higher actually.
We
are on the 70.
Yeah. So as you're looking at the, I guess I'm talking average prices, because I know it dipped down a bit earlier this in the year. But the point I guess I'm getting at is the targets are getting tighter and the prices are expected to increase. And that's going to provide pressure where Europe is, I hope, going to consider more international connections to provide a little price relief here. Because I think waiting to 2040 is quite a long wait. And the price burden between now and then could be pretty significant.
Yeah, it's not only about price, it's also about access to credits, liquidity. So I think the problem needs to be sorted out much earlier.
Right. And I think, and to that point, the supply, the development of the supply is in part related to knowing that there's demand there. So now I think, you know, these two go together and there's always kind of mismatches in it. So when I think back to your question about if it all happened, how fast would it be before you got significant supply? I honestly suspect it could take a couple of 3 years before you get to significant amounts of supply. I hope it's faster than that, but because we need the mitigation faster.
Okay, well, I think this is a nice closing for today. I think the message is clear. Possibilities are there. It's just a matter of political willingness to move forward, and then things can be rolled out relatively quickly. So, Dirk, thanks a lot. It's been a great discussion, and looking forward for other moments like this in the future.